So I've been a pastor for about 20 years now, and I figured out fairly early on that sometimes I would give a message, and people would come up to me afterwards and they would say, like, oh, that was really helpful, and you made these great connections, and I'm gonna remember this for like weeks or months later, and thank you so much for giving that message. And then that same message, I would get an email the next day from a different group of people, smaller but still significant, who would say something like, you know, I didn't actually understand the points you were trying to make there, I didn't put it all together, and I think I may have disagreed with most of the words that came out of your mouth. You've probably had that experience. How is it that you can give the same message with the same content to a group of people, and some people find it incredibly helpful, and others use it as a reason they plan to leave the church now? What is that? So about 10 years ago, I decided to try and understand this dynamic better. And what happened was I ended up finding through a group of like psychologists and sociologists and other pastors that I met with, an understanding, a framework for understanding people's values. Everyone you talk to, everyone you speak with, has a different value system undergirding the entire way that they process information. And that value system is going to very much influence like how they hear what you say and what they choose to do with it. So I just want to share with you briefly, there's like a 90-minute version of this. You are getting the crash course. I want to share with you briefly a little bit about the types of value systems that people in your congregation and in your city have, so that when you are preparing a message, you will be able to speak to each of those value systems as you prepare. Now, this framework is not something I came up with myself. It's something called spiral dynamics, and it's based on the work of the psychologist Claire Graves, and eventually it was driven down by two gentlemen, Don Beck and Christopher Cowan. Don Beck in the 1980s actually made over 60 trips to work with Nelson Mandela in post-apartheid South Africa to try and bring disparate people groups together and work toward a unified purpose. So this has been field tested. They've done assessments of over 50,000 people, and what they have found is that about 98% of the global population fits within one of 6 different value systems. And if you can understand those value systems, you can start to understand the people. So I just want to share with you what those value systems are, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to sell a used car, evolution, a big giant fish, and how you can preach better, and then we'll be done, okay? So the first value system is called Beige, and you move through these one at a time, either as an individual or as a culture. Beige is the color of survival. Beige is the color of homelessness. So if you are in beige, you really can't do much else except think about the next 24 hours or so. So when you see someone tell a homeless person, like, well, they just need to get a job, right? They just need to go, anyone could get a job flipping burgers at McDonald's or Burger King. What we often fail to understand is that someone who's locked into a beige value system and mindset really struggles to do the kinds of activity you would need to do in order to actually get a job. So a lot of times you have to have an address, you have to schedule an interview, you have to have transportation, you may have to have an internet connection so you can fill out an application form. All of those kinds of things require more than 24 hours of thinking in advance. And people who are stuck in beige, they find that really, really challenging. It's hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps when you realize your boots don't actually have straps on them. And that's what beige is. It's the color of addiction then, right? People are just thinking about how can I get the next hit. It's the color of material. And I don't mean materialism in a highly Western, individualistic, middle to upper middle class kind of way. I mean literally the material you need to put clothes on your back or a roof over your head or just food in your mouth. You're just thinking, how can I get that next thing so that I can get to the next day? That's the color of beige. And we find in very, very poor countries all over the world that massive amounts of the population struggle to move past that. They literally don't have the space, the margin, or the material to do so. But sometimes people move from beige into purple. Purple is the color of tribalism. It's the color of mysticism. At purple, this is what happens when the caveman comes out of the cave and starts to understand that there are forces at work in the world that are far beyond them. So they know that there's this like giant fireball in the sky and that sometimes the rain falls, the water from the sky falls. And when that happens, things that they plant or try and grow tend to do better. When that doesn't happen, things do poorly. They also realize that sometimes they may go together collectively as a group on a hunt, right, on a hunting expedition. And sometimes they catch enough kill in the first couple of hours of being gone to bring it back to their camp and to have a giant feast for every single person who's a part of the tribe. And sometimes they chase the same animal for hours or days and come back frustrated and empty-handed. It's almost like the spirit of the hunt is not with them. So purple ends up being the color of tribalism, mysticism, superstition, and disempowerment. It recognizes there are forces at work in the world that are beyond this. And at purple, what you're trying to do is figure out a way to get those forces on your side. So early human beings tried to figure out, how do we get the gods on our side? How do we gain their favor so that things might go well for us? It's a very disempowered level. Now, there's always the chance that at purple, someone will say like, you know what? I am tired of living in a disempowered way, and they will move to red. If purple is the color of disempowerment, red is the color of power. Red is grabbing the bull by the horns. Red is like taking like dominance of myself, like I'm gonna push it forward. Red is the color of ego and will and narcissism and rebellion. Red is the color of rap music. If you've ever listened to a rap album, it's always the same story, right? I was growing up in wherever, the slums of Detroit, and everybody else was stuck in that environment, but I spit rhymes and now I worked my way out and I am here. That's red. I took control of my own destiny. Red is the color of the mafia. Red is the color of Hamas. And oftentimes when you find purple, disempowered people, they will turn to red, powerful, egocentric leaders if they believe that that red power leader will protect them or provide for them or fight for them. So once you start to understand how these different colors work, you'll start to understand how much of a significant role they actually play in our geopolitics. Now, there's always the chance that at red, you'll figure out, man, if we all stay at red, we're all going to kill each other. Like, this is not sustainable. We can't keep doing this. So there's always the chance that you'll move from red to blue. Blue is the color of tradition. It's the color of order. It's the color of dualistic thinking, very black and white. It's the color that really has a high reverence for the book or the code or the law. So this plays out in religious systems, but it also plays out even in politics. So for instance, if you've ever heard someone talk about the Constitution of the United States as if it were a God-created document sent down to us from on high, that is a very blue way of thinking of things. If you've ever heard someone in your church say that the Bible says it, that settles it. That is a very blue way of thinking about things, as if like this, the book, code, or law is all that matters, and there's no real room for interpretation or biblical criticism, right? And blue can be incredibly helpful. Take someone, for instance, who's having an alcohol addiction or a drug addiction. Well, blue is the color of order, and it's the color of dualistic thinking. So a blue value system would say, like, you shouldn't be doing those things. The Bible says not to do those things. So because of that, you are going to like obey these strict rules, and you're going to go by this, and that can really help someone who's living a disordered, out of control, addiction-addled life work themselves into an ordered, sustainable life, right? So blue can be incredibly helpful. But there's always the chance that at blue, which is very dualistic thinking, you start to learn some things about your Bible that seem more confusing and less black and white than you once assumed that they were. For instance, your college student grows up and goes to college, and they start to learn that 1 Samuel says that David killed Goliath, but 2 Samuel says Elhanan killed Goliath. Which one is right? Or they start to understand that, like, the book of Joshua says that the Israelites marched around the walls of Jericho and they all came tumbling down, but that the archaeological evidence doesn't support such a neat understanding of that historical event. Or they start to go and realize, like, there are actually some differences between the stories that are told in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. How many women were at the tomb? And it's not that any of those problems necessarily, like, overturn Christianity. They don't. But they do overturn this ability to think of everything through sheer black and white dualistic thinking. And so orange becomes the color of modernity. Orange is the color of achievement. It's the color of the enlightenment, of individualism. Orange is what happened when human beings began to take the world apart, and we started to realize that, oh, actually, like, math explains way more than we thought it would. Actually, like, we can take some of these ingredients and make medicines that we find helpful. We start to believe that, like, logic, reason, and rationale are actually the thing behind the thing. Those are the most important things. Orange is what happens when your college student goes to college, has a real struggle with the Bible, and then a lot of times that college student will come home to blue, traditional, more fundamentalist parents, and they will start to share, like, I have some concerns. And those dualistic thinking parents, well-meaning, do not know how to answer those concerns. And so they will set up a meeting with their probably also blue dualistic thinking pastor to see if they can help answer the concerns of their child that has now become orange. Those two will meet together and it will not go well. The pastor will say, like, oh, I hear those concerns, but I really just think you need to read Romans 1 and pray more, as if that will just fix everything. And what happens is what Andy Stanley once described as taking fact-based questions and giving them faith-based answers. That phenomenon is when an orange person is trying to gain understanding from a blue person. And those two, what blue finds persuasive, orange does not find persuasive. And so there's just a major mismatch there in the way that they're talking about things. Now, orange has been a predominant color in American business for a very long time and a predominant color within our culture. But a number of decades ago, what started to shade is that people started to realize like, oh, orange doesn't answer, right? The science, the modernity, the rationale, that actually doesn't solve all of my inner longings. For instance, science can tell me why I as a human being do not have a tail. But science can't quite tell me why I find that so interesting. So some people started to move to green. Green is the color of postmodernity. Green is the color of egalitarianism, right? Where we think that like, well, everyone should have a voice and everyone should have equal say and thought. Green is what happened when a lot of people started to realize that they were a part of a tribe. That tribe could be their church community. That tribe could be the country that they were born in. That tribe could be even their high school football team. But I'm a part of different tribes. And sometimes the story that's been really good and significant for my tribe actually hasn't been good for some other tribes. You start to realize that like the success that you or people who were in your tribe experience sometimes came at the expense of other people. And you start to gain more and more concern for the power dynamics in the world that presents. So you recognize that like the American story has a lot of good to it. There's a lot of success and a lot to admire about the American story. But you also learn how that came at the detriment of Native Americans, or you understand like our long fight for civil rights in this country. And you realize like, oh, there was a lot about the story that wasn't good. Or you start to learn that like, oh, Christianity is so helpful and the way of Jesus is absolutely the way that we want to live and that we want to invite people into. And yet also, we have to acknowledge there have been times that the Christian story wasn't so good for some other people. You've learned about the Crusades, or you've learned about the Spanish Inquisition, or you've learned about how even today, oftentimes more fundamentalist Christians will say things that are very, very harmful to those who are in a different value system and way of thinking. So for Green, there's this postmodern idea, and it cares a lot about other tribe stories. It cares a lot about the environment. It cares a lot about making sure that everyone gets equal say. It cares a lot about power dynamics, but it's also highly relativistic, which means that it has a really hard time determining anything that might resemble absolute truth. Like what's good for you is good for you, and what's good for me is good for me. But when you do that, you have a really hard time weighing truth propositions, because not every story is a good story. The Nazi story is not a good story. The Hamas story is not a good story. And when you're in Green, you actually have a really hard time weighing what's good and what's not. Now, every single one of these value systems has pros and cons. The gospel affirms some things about them and pushes back on some things about them. But when you start to understand that most people have a center of gravity within these value systems, it's not that everybody's gonna have a bit of all the colors in them, but most people have a center of gravity, you'll start to understand how you can accommodate someone's value system and center of gravity without compromising your own value system, your own Christian faith. So for instance, the way that you even sell something to someone is gonna be very different depending on what color they're in. So let's just take used cars as an example. How do you sell a used car to a person who is red, right? That power, that dominance, that ego, that will, that more narcissistic tendency. Well, if you've ever seen a hot rod magazine, you know what they do. They put a woman with very few clothes on the roof of that car or next to that car, and that shows them that I have power over this person and this vehicle, and right? That's the way that you sell a used car. You put a lady in a bikini next to it, to a red person, that helps them. How do you sell someone who's like a blue traditionalist in the South? How do you sell them a used car? You raise the American flag and you crank up the Toby Keith, right? You let them know hey, we're in the same tribe here. We think the same way. How do you sell it to someone who's orange? You're very logical, and this is one that J.D. Power and Vance and Associates award the last 5 years running. This is the right choice for you. And how do you sell it to someone who's green? It's a hybrid, right? You've got to figure out how to tailor your message to whoever it is that's hearing it. You do that in all kinds of professions and all kinds of jobs. That's how they do it. So you can start to imagine then when it comes to your preaching and your teaching, how it is that you might tell different stories or talk about different passages if you know who is in the crowd. As you move through these different colors, from beige to purple to red to blue to orange to green, what happens is at each step along the way, you transcend and include. So red has transcended purple, but still includes the value systems and the understandings that they received at purple. Green has transcended orange, but still includes those things that they learned or that the culture handed them at orange. So that's a helpful thing to know, because it's not that one of these is great and the other is bad. These all have pros and cons to them. And as you go through, you transcend and you include. The other thing that's very important for you to realize, because you'll see this dynamic taking place all the time, is that we tend to look forward with great fear and back with great disdain. So someone who is a blue traditionalist, they are fearful of green postmodernists. And they believe that if the green postmodernists get their way, it will be the end of their country, their belief system, their people, their church. So they're fearful of that. Someone who's a green postmodernist looking back at blue, they have a great amount of disdain often for someone who's blue. They are too small-minded. They care more about their own tribe than anybody else. They always think that they're right. They see the world black and white, right? And both of them are right in some ways about the other. And yet we look forward with great fear and backward with great disdain. This is a real challenge here in the US, by the way, and most of the political challenges that we have had over the last several years can actually be understood and explained through this lens. Lots of people who have struggled with our current political dynamics, this is really, it's a spiral dynamics, it's a color war, is what it is, between people who are in different segments of society. And you, pastor, you're caught in the middle of it. How do you represent the gospel to people who think about it so differently? So let me give you two examples, and then I'll be done. The first one I want to talk about is science and faith. I have, for the last decade or so, really been trying to help my congregation understand that science and faith are not at war with one another, right? Now, I grew up in a congregation that believed that the earth was about 6,000 years old, and we believed that if you believed in evolution, then you probably were, basically the devil himself. So, how do you come out of that? Because, to a person who's orange or green, that kind of way of thinking is just very unappealing. And frankly, it's not necessary to view the Bible like that. That's a very blue, traditionalist, black and white, non-dualistic way of thinking, way of looking at it, right? So when you have a congregation, and most of the congregations I've led have had a combination largely of blue, orange, and green in it. So how do you say something that's helpful for all three of those? Well, if I want to convince my congregation that lots of well-meaning Christians who very much believe the Bible, they believe it's the inspired and authoritative word of God, but they also believe that God used something like evolution and that it's okay to believe that. See, my oranges love that because I'm giving them permission to think that science has something helpful to say to everybody. My greens love it because anything we can do to widen the tent and bring more people in, they just love that. It's the blue traditionalists that may struggle with that. So what do? Well, I could quote Neil deGrasse Tyson or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins. They have some great quotes around evolution and faith and science like that, but that won't be helpful for them. Why? Because blue knows that Richard Dawkins is not in their tribe. They know that Neil deGrasse Tyson is not in their tribe, right? So I found a quote a few years ago from an evangelist who said this. He said that the important thing that Genesis teaches us is that God created everything. And that what we need to know from that reading is that regardless of how he created it, whether he used evolution or some other mechanism, he is the origin of all things. That's a great quote. I shared it with our whole church as we walked through this just a few months ago. That quote was from Billy Graham. Billy Graham has a ton of credibility with blue traditionalists because blue traditionalists understand that Billy Graham is in their tribe. What Billy Graham finds persuasive, my blue traditionalists find persuasive. My oranges were happy to hear it from anybody, and my greens were just happy that we could all get along for once, right? So that is a way to just talk about an issue that can be really divisive in a way where there's a little something for everyone to hook onto. Another example, I'd love to talk to you for just a moment about Jonah. There's a book in the Bible, right, called Jonah. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this book. It is the strangest book, perhaps, in all of the Old Testament, or it's at least in the top three. And it tells this story almost in the way that a Tarantino film would tell it, right? It ends in an ambiguous way with Jonah being mad at God and God kind of having a mic drop moment at the end of it. But a lot of times in our churches, when we tell this story, the thing we get hung up over and over again is on the stupid fish. Was the fish real? Was it a whale? Was it something else? We can't stop talking about the fish. So when you approach a story like that and you're thinking through it in the lens of spiral dynamics and people's value systems, how do you set it up so that it's helpful for multiple people, right? Because this story is about Jonah being called to go and give the goodness and grace of God to his greatest enemy. He refuses to do that, and he gets swallowed by the fish, and then he chooses to go, and he sees God, because of his going, choose to be merciful to a people that Israel could not stand. That's actually why Jonah gets so upset about it. It's an important story for us to grapple with today, and so we can't get hung up on the fish. So what do? Well, for my blues in the crowd, right, my traditionalists, they say, well, if this fish wasn't real, if this story didn't literally happen, you might as well deny the resurrection of Jesus, right? That's kind of their mindset. For my oranges, they're thinking like, if you're gonna tell me that I have to believe that a man got swallowed up and was in the belly of a fish for 3 whole days and that literally happened, then I'm out, man. Like that is just a crazy thing to believe. And for my greens, they don't care because they just love a good story, right? So what am I doing to address my greens and my blues? Well, I'm challenging them and I'm affirming them as we go along the way. So for my blue people, I want to say, hey, there are some scholars who believe that this story was written during the exile period of Israel's history by a group of wise Jewish sages who essentially wrote it as a parable to teach a lesson. And it may or may not have happened in history. But here's the challenge for my blues. Do we believe that a story's truth value has to be directly tied to its historicity? Or do we believe that sometimes there is truth to be found in that which is written to show a point? For my oranges, I want to ask, do you have to believe that everything that God is capable of doing in the world can be measured, tested, seen with the eye, fit into a natural phenomena? Or is it possible that the God who you believe created the entire universe sometimes could work in miraculous and supernatural ways? By doing that, it takes the focus off the fish, and it gives both groups permission to possibly rethink a thing that they thought that they were settled on, and it allows us to get to the point of the story. The point of the story is that God is asking Jonah, do you trust me and love me enough to go share my goodness and my grace with even your greatest enemy? And as we read that story today, that is still the story that God, and the question that God is asking of us. In a world that's completely polarized, in a world where every news station, every newspaper, every blog, and every podcast is trying to cater specifically to one of these value systems, what is the church doing to try and bring unity and cohesion? What are we doing to say hey, do you trust and love God enough to take the message of the gospel to everyone, including those who are red or blue or orange or green? And as you start to think through the value systems that people have, you can start to tailor your messages so that they reach and include more people. So a couple of questions just to end with as you think through this. First of all, who is in your church? Who is in your church that you need to be more thoughtful about how you frame up a sermon or a set of questions or the way that you teach so that you can be more helpful to the place that they are? And here's the second question. Who do you want to be in your church? Because if there's a group of people that you're not reaching, and I just got to tell you, statistically speaking, many churches are missing out on younger people, and more younger people are going to fall into that green postmodern mindset. Who do you want to reach? Because if you're not framing up the gospel in a way that it can be accessible and helpful for them, then you may be missing out on an entire generation that desperately needs to hear about the grace and mercy and love of what Jesus did on the cross and the power that he's given them in life through his resurrection and through the coming of the Holy Spirit. So my hope for you is that you will use some of these as a starting place, right? We could say so much more about this, but as a starting place to think through your own sermon preparation and how it is that you are being equally helpful to people from a range of backgrounds and value systems. Best of luck to you, and please know that I think of you all the time because the work we do is hard.